Now, when I ask on social media which classic Doctor Who story I should try and watch at a future point, a lot of the time I do get some of the same answers. Some of the ones I've seen, such as The Invasion or The Caves of Androzani, others of which I haven't seen, such as the Patrick Troughton story The Mind Robber or the Seventh Doctor story The Curse of Fenric. I'll get to them in time, but next up was one that a lot of people were saying that I should watch at some point, so I finally did. The Fourth Doctor story, City of Death, the second serial of Doctor Who's 17th season, first broadcast in 4 parts from the 29th of September to the 20th of October 1979. The Fourth Doctor, played by Tom Baker, and his companion Romana, played by Lalla Ward, are just enjoying a day out in Paris. To which we actually see them taking the train rather than using the TARDIS to go everywhere, which I admit is refreshing to see. But soon they find weird things happening. Time seems to be repeating itself. Seconds keep repeating. Minutes. And soon they find out why. They find themselves kind of being followed by a British detective named Duggan, played by Tom Chadbourne. And they ultimately get themselves embroiled in a scheme with Count Scarlione, an infamous art criminal played by Julian Glover, along with his wife, the Countess, played by Catherine Schell, a scientist named Kerensky, played by David Graham, and the butler, played by Kevin Flood, named Herman. Which has led to one line that people do like to quote, which is, "What a wonderful butler, he's so violent." But anyway, while I was watching this story, I was watching it with family members, and there was one family member who was like, "This seems to remind me a lot of Sharda." I was like, "I can't think why. I mean, they were written by different people. I mean, okay, the same companions in the same sort of time frame, but I don't know." Until eventually we looked it up and found out why. The reason why this story seemed familiar to them or reminded them of Sharda is because the writer of this story, David Agnew, isn't actually a real person. David Agnew was a pseudonym used by 3 different writers working together, those being David Fisher, Douglas Adams, and Graham Williams. And they felt that the story was rather familiar. One, it reminded them of Sharda, which was, of course, a story that Douglas Adams wrote that was never broadcast. And the other was that this effectively follows the same storyline as a book that Adams would publish in 1987 called Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. And from what we saw and from what they described it to me, I personally haven't read the book, but it follows the storyline of that book practically to a fault. To which I am going to have to go into spoilers for this. So for for those who just want to skip it and don't want a story, end the review here. I'd say it's a good story. Check it out for yourself. But if you don't mind spoilers, stick around. If you don't want to have it spoiled for you until you've watched the story, go ahead. Still here? Good. Because it turns out that Scarlione, the Count who's seemingly an art criminal, there's a lot more to him than meets the eye. He is actually an alien known as Scaroth, a member of the Jaggeroth race. And seemingly 400 million years ago, his people, they were around on Earth at the time. Human race wasn't even a thing yet. And a mistake caused their ship to explode. And he... Scaroth's consciousness was scattered throughout time, allowing him to exist in several places at once. Okay, and he wants to effectively find a way to get back to the original time period and stop that accident from happening. In order to do this, he needs to effectively build a time machine, or needs to build a machine capable of sending him back in time. However, in order to finance this, in order for Kerensky, the scientist, to be able to build this machine, they need money. And in order to do this, he partakes in the art thefts. But he does it in a very clever way, which is that a version of him existed around the time of Leonardo da Vinci, the artist who ultimately painted the Mona Lisa. And what he has them do is that in the past, his self kind of makes Leonardo da Vinci paint 7 versions of the Mona Lisa. 6 of them he has stored away kind of elsewhere. The 7th is the one that's currently hanging in the Louvre. And what he plans to do is he plans to rob the Louvre of the Mona Lisa, and then there are 7 art dealers who would pay a pretty price to have the Mona Lisa in their collection. But of course, nobody's going to pay top price if the original version is still hanging in the Louvre. So he steals it from the Louvre. He then is able to sell all 7 versions of the Mona Lisa in order to get the money he needs to build this machine. Everyone thinks they have the original version of the Mona Lisa, and he is able to build it. But then there is one small caveat that comes along with the plan, which is that the explosion that killed his people happened 400 million years ago, back before the human race was a thing, when it was merely a forethought. And the explosion scattered chemical soup and provided the radiation that would ultimately lead to the mutation of everything and eventually lead to the human race. His race's destruction is what caused the human race to have the possibility to exist. But if he goes back and stops the explosion, well, then the human race would cease to exist. So it's up to the Doctor, Romana, and Duggan to try and find a way to stop him. So it does follow pretty much exactly the plot of Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. So you could argue that this was maybe a testing ground for Douglas Adams, just to see if the storyline would work before he wrote the story 8 years later, or before he published it. Now, why do people like this story? Well, it does have a lot going for it. I mean, there's no K9, which I felt he wasn't exactly missed. I mean, there are some stories where it does feel like he's a little bit absent, but here he is mentioned once. But K9, he wasn't really relevant to the story, so I'm happy they left him out. But once again, it features a great villain with Julian Glover as the Count, or Scaroth. I mean, the Countess is also really enjoyable as a character. Kerensky is really interesting, at least before they kill him up. Herman is a delight as he's a butler. Hell, there's even a cameo from John Cleese in this story, which, just to say that John Cleese was in Doctor Who, that's brilliant. I mean, there's a scene in part 4 where him and Eleanor Bron are two art critics, and the Doctor has parked the TARDIS. I'm not sure if it's in the Louvre or just in another museum, but they're saying about the artistic merits of the TARDIS, how it shouldn't exist, but it does, and that's what makes it artistically relevant. To which the Doctor, Romana, and Duggan then just come in, climb aboard the TARDIS, and it disappears, and they're like, magnificent. It's brilliant, just to say John Cleese is in it. So, yeah, I will admit the story does get a little bit confusing from time to time, but I do see why people consider this one a classic. And even the bit at the end where, essentially, due to them stopping Scaroth, 6 of the 7 Mona Lisas are destroyed, including the original. And the problem is that the Doctor, when he was back in Leonardo's workshop, he wrote, "This is a fake" on 6 of them in felt tip, to which the only... people won't notice, it's been painted over, but the only way that they'll know is if they run a black light over it, and they'll see "This is a fake" written in felt tip beneath the canvas. To which the Doctor then admits, well, it'll be their own fault then for looking at it with a black light. But the thing is, as long as it's being appreciated, it's still art. I do prefer the Simpsons' take on this. Like, they did one in their later seasons talking about similar things. Like, you only appreciated the painting when you thought it was by someone famous. A true artist or a true critic can appreciate art anywhere, whether it's hanging in the Louvre or on a freshman's wall. Which I did prefer their take on it, but you know what? This is still great. The Doctor is still saying that it's still been painted by Leonardo da Vinci. It is still the Mona Lisa. The only difference is it's got a small mark underneath it with a black light. So, to which I do love it, and I do see why people love this story. I mean, it's got some great characters, a great villain, a great setup, and it would ultimately lead to a good book, which, of course, Douglas Adams will publish 8 years later. So, there you go, there's my quick thoughts on City of Death. People consider it a classic? I'd say so, yeah. Anyway, I've no idea. Once again, I've no idea what my next classic story will be. It may not happen until next year, but there you go. That's my quick thoughts on the classic City of Death. Anyway, until next time, see ya.